USIP, the United States Institute of Peace, was established by Congress in 1984. We are part of the US federal government. President Ronald Reagan signed us into law. Even though that is our birthday, we really trace our direct origins back a couple of decades. In the 1960s, you had people like Senator Mark Hatfield from Oregon, Congressman, and then Senator Sparks Matsunaga from Hawaii, who were newly elected to Congress, but they were also veterans of World War II. And they saw firsthand the impact that violent conflict and war had on individual communities, citizens, and countries. Senator Matsunaga was twice injured in Europe and North Africa, despite his fellow Japanese Americans being interned at home. Mark Hatfield was one of the first US servicemen in Hiroshima after the atomic bombing. So these experiences really stayed with them. And when they were elected to Congress, they started asking themselves the question of, we have these places that we can go to study war. You can go to the military academies. There's courses in the strategy of defense and wartime. But we don't have the equivalent to study peace and the other side of the story. However, it takes a while sometimes to get things through Congress, and they weren't gaining all that much traction until the 1970s, when a grassroots movement started across the United States. You have to think, since World War II, the country faced Korean War. They were going through the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. The civil rights movement was going on at this time. And so everyday American citizens started asking themselves that important question. Why does history keep repeating itself? Why can't we learn to do this work better and make change through nonviolent action and prevent conflicts from breaking out in the first place? So this grassroots movement combined with congressional leadership, and in 1979, President Jimmy Carter asked Sparks Matsunaga to study what would this thing look like if we were to do a peace academy to complement our military academies. What would it do, and is now the right time? Senator Matsunaga and his colleagues didn't just stay in Washington, D.C. They traveled across the country. They held town halls in 10 different cities, and that is what led to the USIP Act in 1984. I'm going to share just a brief quote that sort of frames how we work today. This is actually a portion of the USIP Act, and you see in the photo President Reagan, Senator Mark Hatfield, and Senator Sparks Matsunaga. And a couple of things I want to highlight here. First, the Institute is an independent part of the federal government. While we receive our funding directly from Congress, we're not part of the executive branch of the government. We work very closely with our colleagues in the State Department, the Defense Department, the U.S. Agency for International Development, but we're independent from them. The other thing I want to highlight is that we only work on international peace and conflict issues. USIP was established to work on building peace around the world, and we do very limited work here domestically, but what we do focus on, and that focus is mostly talking about international conflict issues. So that is USIP's history. But I want to focus most of our time today on what we do now. And 4 of you have seen our lovely home on the National Mall. This is a photo of our headquarters, and you can also see it just behind me is the inside view. I have Mr. Lincoln over my shoulder, the Lincoln Memorial. And we call our building a symbol of peace. There's a lot of, the architect, Moshe Safdie, based out of Boston, Massachusetts, incorporated design elements to reflect our mission. Our roof is in the shape of a dove. It's an open and transparent space. And he did that because he wanted to reflect our mission, but also because of where we are in Washington, D.C. You see us in the lower corner. We're right on the National Mall, across from the monuments of President Lincoln, and which focuses quite a bit on the Civil War, the Korean War Memorial, the Vietnam Veteran War Memorial, the World War II Memorial. All these monuments that talk about our country's sacrifices during wartime. And then you have our building, which is a literal symbol of our commitment to peace. So we take our location very seriously, and we love opening our doors to people who are able to come to Washington, D.C., learn more about who we are and what we do. But when you can't come to D.C., we try to make it happen virtually, and so that you can learn that yes, we are a symbol, but we are actually doing real, concrete, hard work around the world. And that's what I want to get into now. Before I do, is there any questions on the history of USIP? No? Okay. So let me get into how we work now, and I want to throw out a theoretical framework. Has anyone ever heard of John Paul Lederach? Okay, if you take a peace and conflict studies course, you likely will at some point. He has done a lot of writing on how peace building and conflict management happens, but this is one of his seminal frameworks of analysis, and there's a lot of different interpretations of it. So essentially, it's how peace building happens, and the fact that peace building has to happen at all these different levels in order to be effective and long-lasting. So this is how USIP also operates in a lot of ways. You see the bottom is the grassroots, the largest portion of the triangle. You have the middle range leadership, and then you have the top level as well. So the three examples, some of the examples I'm going to be giving you fit into this framework, so you can see how all the different elements of USIP's work complements each other. So first, when we talk about our work, there's a lot of stuff that we do that's a regular think tank in DC. Events like the one you see here, policy analysis, media interviews, testifying before Congress, all on different peace and conflict themes. But what makes USIP different is we are active in about 40 countries around the world, either through direct programs or grants. Our headquarters are in Washington, but we have offices in Tunisia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Burma, and then my staff travels to South Sudan or Colombia or China for different programs. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of how we act. And the first one is this photo. Anything stand out to you in the picture besides the word referee written on one gentleman's shirt?
Camera equipment.
Okay, you see the camera equipment on half the photo. What about the group of people?
It's all men.
It's all men. Can you guess their professions?
I do see somebody in uniform, looks like.
2 military leaders, maybe?
Okay, so you see some military folks, some civilians, some people in casual clothes, a little bit more formal. This is a part of a project we call our Justice and Security Dialogues, or JSDs, which is essentially how can you get communities and security forces, the police, to work together to prevent crime and to prevent extremism. In a lot of the places that USIP operates, the trust between these two groups has been deteriorated. The people don't trust the police to enforce the laws. They might be corrupt. They might have been used as a tool of an authoritarian regime. And on the other side, the police don't trust the people. The people might be pursuing vigilante justice. They might not be reporting their crimes. They might not be, with resources supporting a central security force. So through the process of facilitated dialogue, we eventually bring the two groups. We talk to each group, hear what their concerns are, and eventually bring them together and help rebuild that trust. And this particular one is happening in the country of Burkina Faso, in a city called Saba. And it was filmed for a documentary that is currently making the rounds called Saba, which tells the story of the soldier, the child rights activist, the religious leader, and how they go through this process. So that's one example of USIP's work. Sort of, if you think back to the triangle, that bottom level, the grassroots, everyday citizen work. The next thing I'm going to try to do is show you a video which tells the story sort of from that middle tier of the triangle, the middle range leadership. These are your influential religious or community leaders, your business leaders, the people who can really help mobilize masses. And this is going to tell the story of some work that USIP did in Iraq in 2007. So this is one example of the work that we do sort of with those mid-level government leaders. And I use an example from 2007 because this film was shot last year with the members of the 10th Army Mountain Brigade reflecting on their time in Iraq. And the video that you saw of Mahmoudiyya in its peaceful state is from last year, despite all the bad news and violence that we hear coming out of Iraq. That locally facilitated and agreed upon peace accord is still holding. And it's a model that USIP has been using across the country and really around the region to help build these local peace accords. And one thing that's so important to highlight in any of our work is the work with local partners. You'll notice the American staff, we were not the ones at the forefront of this. It was the Iraqis we've been training and working with for years, who were the people leading the negotiations, leading the dialogues. We were just there providing what's called technical support. So that was the bottom and the middle portions of the triangle. And then one last example I want to share is from Colombia, which kind of represents what USIP does at the top and the bottom at the same time. Colombia just went through 50 years of civil war. It was finally the main rebel group, the FARC, and the Colombian government came together for a peace process. And USIP helped support the peace process by making sure that victims and women were able to have a seat at the table to be part of this formal national process. But that only holds, those top level agreements only hold if you have the support at the local level. So that's where we worked with women like these from across the country, from different religious groups, and train them in the process of reconciliation. You have to think, a place that has had 50 years of civil war, there are victims on all sides. There are people who are victims of the rebels. There are victims of government action. You have ex-combatants who are now being demobilized and sent home. And you might have victims living next door to somebody who might have been responsible for the death or disappearance of their mother or brother or cousin. So the process of reconciliation is how can you work through all these different conflicting emotions and issues about justice, processes, so that eventually the two people living next door to each other can move on and support the ultimate peace agreement that's been made. So USIP trains these women. One of them is actually an ex-combatant. One of them lost her son. They had to reconcile their differences before even going out into their own communities. So those are 3 examples of how we act. So we say we think, we act, and then lastly, I just want to quickly say we educate. We take all of the best practices, all of that analysis, the experience on the ground, and we help empower others to manage their conflicts without violence. We do this through programs like Generation Change, which you see here, fellows, young people from around the world, meeting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama on a 4-day exchange. The 2018 version of this program is happening in a few weeks. We have a professional training academy. And then we also work at engaging the American people and making sure that they understand that the work of international peace building doesn't just happen around overseas. It's something that's really important for our national security and how we work today. That's where my team comes into play. We are the public education department, so we work with schools and teachers and communities across the country who are just interested in first learning more about peace, but then doing things for peace. Tomorrow is the International Day of Peace, and we have our Peace Day Challenge, which I'm crediting all of you for taking to come learn about peace building. And that was to turn a day, one of many UN symbolic days that exist out there, into a day of action. And over the past 4 years, we've engaged hundreds of millions of people on social media, encouraged activities in almost every single state, and it's really inspiring each year to see the momentum building. We've been checking social media all day today as we have elementary schools from Arkansas to high schools in New Jersey, all doing something to recognize the Day of Peace. And so that's kind of the overview of how the examples of USIP that I wanted to share. And before I turn it over to questions, I want to stress two main conceptual things. The first is about the word conflict. When we think about the word conflict, the first things that come to mind are war, violence, death, so all these negative things. Here at USIP, we actually have a dictionary of terms in the field, and conflict itself is inherently neutral. There's always going to be disagreements between individuals and communities and countries, but what USIP believes is that these differences can be managed without violence and actually be a very positive, transformative experience. It's only when conflicts become violent that they're negative or bad. So we're not trying to rid the world of conflict, just violent conflict. And then also on the peace side, sometimes when people hear that we're the U.S. Institute of Peace, they get a very specific vision in their head about what peace means. Sometimes it's very fluffy, it's hard to define, but words like harmony or compassion or love come up. But we refer to our work really as peace building. It's the process of how do you establish a legal system that allows for compassion for victims and perpetrators, and that treats everyone equally. It's an active, long-term process that happens to make peace possible. So the work that USIP is doing is not sort of focused on the end state. It's focused on the process of how can we get communities and countries to places where their conflicts are handled non-violently. And it really is a long-term project. The JSD programs I mentioned could take months or years to happen. The intervention in Iraq was a months-long dialogue process. We've done a similar one more recently that took 6 months just to get everyone together in a room to talk through the issues and to create. So the commitment and passion of people in the peace building field is very impressive. And they are really out there doing important work on behalf of the United States. And our partners in conflict zones are putting themselves in danger to commit to really actions that they believe in and for the betterment of their community and their security. So that's where I'd like to leave it and open up to any questions that people have. Could be anything about the Institute, working here, careers, domestic, Peace Day Challenge.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, my question is, it sounds like you guys do like a lot of like behind the scenes work. I was wondering if you could kind of describe more what that's like and what that would entail.
Yeah, so one thing that's really unique about USIP's work is the fact that we're not always, our priority is not to have our logo on everything. Our priority is to support programs that make a difference. And we do that through a lot of work with local partners. Iraq is an example of a model that we've created called our networks of facilitators. So we work on training our local partners in the skills that we've learned and developed so that they are the ones at the forefront. So what that means is, in the case of generation change, these are young people, and as the UNA folks probably know, the international definition of youth varies, but it could be 30 and under, 34 and under. And so these are young people who are already making a difference in their community. They're working to combat extremism, to provide opportunities for children, but they might not have the knowledge or skills or platform to take their work to the next level. So we bring those individuals together, like with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, so that they can actually do trainings. And what does it mean to negotiate? What does it mean to be advocate for your program, for the work that you're doing? And then we send them back out into their home communities to do their work. That said, there are some very high-profile things that USIP does. We, in our wonderful headquarters building in Washington, D.C., we're known when world leaders come to Washington, they come here to talk about the pressing international issues. We've hosted over 35 heads of state who come here to talk about what's happening in their country, because USIP has that reputation of being an honest broker and a great partner for peace. We also help facilitate some pretty high-level commissions and study groups. You might have heard of the Iraq Study Group in the past. We currently have one that's focusing on I'm gonna get this name wrong, the Task Force on Countering Extremism. And so these are sort of more your blue ribbon panels of really your top level thinkers coming together and analyzing what's going on in the world. Any other questions?
I have another one.
Okay.
Do you have any like trainings or programs that would be available to like us as
Just this week, we have a full-on global campus that offers online training programs. And up until this week, they had been 13-hour courses that you need to spend anywhere between $200 to $600 to do and get credit. You can actually go online now and take the 3-hour versions of them to help understand some of the concepts and skills. So that is a great new resource. Just search USIP Global Campus and they'll come up. We also have something called our Peace Building Toolkit for Curriculum, or Peace Building Toolkit for Educators. And it is designed for the high school and middle school classroom, but that's only in how some of the examples are portrayed. The high school version is all about skill development. It's how do you understand your own conflict style. We all approach conflict differently. Some of us are avoiders, some of us are competers, some of us are compromisers. So it talks you through that process. It talks you through conflict analysis, mediation, negotiation, active listening. Communication skills are so important in our field. And that document is available for free to download online. And you can use it in group settings, you can use it in classes. We've had teachers use it to help study groups work better together. So there's all these different free resources that we do have.
What are some of the other ongoing programs you guys have around the world?
So one of the big exciting things, one of the big focuses that we have right now is this concept of preventing electoral violence. You have a lot of countries hitting really important elections in the next few years. You have Afghanistan. The Nigeria one right now is a huge focus because anyone study Nigeria, focus up Nigeria? No? Nigeria is a country that is essentially 50% Christian and 50% Muslim. So there is the religious divides, but there's also geographic and tribal divides between the north and the south. And there's a lot of different elements at play in their elections. And so USIP for a long time has been supporting the northern governors and providing them a platform to organize and sort of operate on the same level as the southern president and sort of some of the more power holders. But what we're doing right now is we're focusing on their upcoming elections at the beginning of next year. And when the international community looks at elections that are potentially going to break out in violence, they might send an observer mission a month before, send out their observers to where they think there might be violence, where there's been violence in the past, where there might be some voter fraud in the past. But it's not always the most efficient method that's being used. So what USIP has spent the last year doing is working with Nigerian polling and Nigerian companies is how can we actually anticipate through research where this violence is going to break out in advance so that we know when we decide where to send observers, they're actually going to the places where they can make a difference by their presence. And so that's been a year-long effort that's really just launching now. And will be kicking up quite a bit in the near future. Because I know this session came to us because of the UNA USA event that was hosted here. One question we often get is, what do we do with the United Nations? Do we work with them often? We don't necessarily partner a lot on projects on the ground. We do some training for peacekeepers. But we work on a lot of the same issues. In particular, UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and 2250, which is focused on youth, peace, security. So how can we get these important populations involved in peace processes, give them a seat at the table that they deserve so that they can be an important part of their society and country. So we do a lot of work on gender issues and youth issues.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are you guys involved in work on the Sustainable Development Goals in any way?
The SDGs. So our heart falls in SDG number 16 on peace, of course. But what we have found is our work as an institute touches on so many different goals. And even though we don't frame our work in the overarching concepts of each of the SDGs, we are working on rule of law issues. We understand that environmental issues, access to resources, water, mineral rights, things like that are huge drivers of conflict. Humanitarian issues, the treatment of girls, women, and children in either as refugees or opportunities for education, all of these different things feed into creating a stable country. And at the heart of USIP, let me backtrack a sec. So our president, Nancy Lindborg, spent her entire life working in development. So she was head of Mercy Corps, she was assistant administrator at USAID. So she was always responsible for responding to disaster, to delivering the aid, to making sure things were taken care of afterwards. And she uses the stat that in approximately the last 10 years, our international assistance has gone from about 80% used to respond to natural disasters and 20% to respond to violent conflict, to now it's flipped. About 80% of our aid is sent to respond to violent conflict, humanitarian disasters, and 20% natural disasters. And I think this is where the SDGs come into play. The reason that happens, and the reason that so many communities keep entering a cycle of violence, is because of the concept of fragility. You really need to work, and through the SDGs and the work of USIP, to build really important infrastructures in communities around the world to make them stronger, to make them more resilient so that they can withstand shocks to their system without resorting to violence. And I think that's where both the SDGs and USIP's work really focus on this idea of of getting ahead of the stream of humanitarian crises. How can we prevent it from getting to that point that results in massive issues of violence, or massive environmental issues, or massive needs of people to move? Any other?
So our theme this year is based on water politics and water sustainability. And we even have the UN Special Rapporteur for water sanitation and clean drinking water coming later in the semester. How does work with like environmental sustainability follow within the guidelines of USIP?
So this is an area, especially on water, that USIP has not focused. We are a very small part of the federal government, so we really have to narrow our focus. If we do find in a community that we're working, every time we go in, we do a conflict analysis. What are people fighting about? Is it truly about religion, or is it about access to market? Is it about access to water? And if we find that something like that is part of the drivers of conflict, we will work with local populations to address it. But sort of the more bigger, as an area of focus, it's not something that we do in-house. It is an important issue. It's a part of the peace building field that other people are working on. It's just not our area of focus right now.
Question: do you find that like you guys interact differently with religious leaders versus more like political leaders?
I think it depends in every circumstance. Is there a particular example that you're thinking of, or what led you to ask that question?
I'm just interested in like religion and peace building. And how
We have an entire program that focuses on religion and peace building. It can be, religion is something that can either be an amazing force for good or an amazing force for violence. And it's important to understand both sides. Sometimes it can be more effective to work through the religious leaders than political leaders. It's all about looking at who that mid-range, that level 2, who has the influence over the people. Is it truly your religious leaders, or is it their elected officials? Who do your people feel more closely to? Going back to the Nigeria example, our work there started with a program that's called the Pastor and the Imam, a Christian pastor, Islamic imam, who were both perpetrators of violence and were responsible for great destruction and attacks on the other side. Eventually came together and said, look, we can't survive this. And so the two of them coming together made a huge impact that political leaders might not have. We also find that sometimes religious leaders can be used to put pressure on political leaders to go in a certain direction to make a difference. But then you have the example of Mahmoudiyya in Iraq, where the tribal leaders, yes, they're affiliated with specific religions. They might be Sunni or Shia, but it's their leadership position in their communities, or that more political leadership, that really made that piece possible. So it's just really understanding the specific context.
How do most people come to the institute, and where do they often go from there?
So what do you think people need to study to work here?
Peace.
Anything.
That's what I was hoping you were going to say. I don't know.
Yeah, so we surveyed most people. I'm a political scientist major. That's what I did my undergrad in. My master's is in Chinese studies. A lot of the people I work with went the political science, the international affairs route. But we did a survey of our staff, and we found we had 24 different collegiate majors represented. We have anthropologists, we have lawyers, economists. We have people who focus in specific languages or cultures. We had a rocket scientist on staff at the time. So it's all these different areas that come into play when you're building peace. And I know I was poking around OSU's website, and I noticed that the International Affairs degree is offered as a BA or a BS. So you could do the arts or the sciences, because there is a huge science and tech component to it. So we use the expression of there are many ways to be a peace builder. It's about finding what you care about and using that to make a difference. In very practical terms, USIP is an interesting, diverse group of people. Some come directly from the more academic field. They've done research, policy analysis, and they come in that. We have a good number of former military who are now stationed, who are with us. And then we have people who spent their lives working in conflict zones who come back. There's a lot of fluidity at the Institute in terms of where you come from and where you go. And it's an important hallmark that I said up front, we are an independent government agency. So we are not going in on behalf of the US government. We're a little bit nonprofit, we're a little bit government, we're a little bit academic. And that creates a space for all those different communities to come together and talk about the same issues, which is pretty unique in Washington, especially. If you are ever personally interested in working at the United States Institute of Peace, we do have a paid internship program. It's called Research Assistants. They are for students at the Consortium of DC Schools. So pretty much any of the universities in the DC area, if you're coming to DC for grad school or any other academic opportunities. And it's a really great opportunity to get exposure to the Institute and to work very closely with a team here. So that is one way to come in. The other is to come in as an entry-level staff member, which is a program assistant, where you're nitty-gritty in the details of how all this works in terms of management and budget and working on different time zones and managing a DC component and a component in Juba, South Sudan. So those are the different things. You know, you guys have my contact information. I'm here as a resource, so if you're ever interested in learning more about careers in peace building, or you're going to be in DC, shoot me an email. I'd love to have you come over for coffee and talk about what you're interested in.
We'd like to thank you for your time. Everyone, I think she deserves a nice round of applause.
You might get an email from me.
You will be
Yes.
absolutely amazing. We will be distributing your email through our Facebook group later tonight.
Okay.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
also. Thank you for coming. I think it's really important that we're able to talk about peace and conflict as something a little different. And I really hope that we're able to stay in touch as you go through the year. Consider USIP a resource for other speakers, if there's subject area experts. We have a lot of great events that are happening that are all webcast for free. So consider us a resource. We work on behalf of the American taxpayer.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Have a great night.
Thank you.